This is a comment about government money because I'm a nonprofit. We're not a faith-based, but all of us are believers. Mm-hmm. We try to be very smart with that, and I have a $10 million marriage grant. And it's a marriage grant that came out of the TANF money, which is for welfare. But I know the person at the Heritage Foundation who wrote the public policy to reduce poverty through strengthening families. So here's how we get around that government stuff. Okay, if we have a marriage workshop in a church, the pastor might want to come and pray with the couples, but it's an outreach. We don't say you have to be a believer, you have to go to this church. We do this outreach and we try to teach you the skills to love well in your marriage and stay married. So we ask the pastor not to do that, but when the workshop is over, we say out loud, "It is over. This is over," and we turn the lights on and off. "It is over." And then they're welcome to leave, but then we let the pastor come in and say prayers. Okay? Because we always suspect that a mole's in the room to come, But people stay of their own free will, and then they join the church, and then they get all that blessing that comes from being with believers. So we get around, look, if Christians didn't take the money, then all the non-Christians will get it.
You know what, there's nothing wrong with taking the money, as long as, like Jesus says, you know what, he wants us to be wise as serpents, but innocent as doves. And so I think that's a good example of that, yeah. And the wealth of the wicked is laid up for the righteous, I mean.
That's right.
It's the modern parable of the shrewd managers.
Yeah. So, yeah, I applaud you.
Go ahead. Let's go over here.
Paul Grodell, you touched on it a little bit about wanting to get a women's program, but I mean the video and everything was all about men. There's 4 men at the table.
Right.
Is offering these programs to the men, getting them off addiction, is it a bigger problem than women having problems? In other words, the men are also doing things to the women. They're not supporting their kids. Mm-hmm. So is it just that you guys happen to fall into this? You're men, you were addicts, whatever, and so you relate to that, or is it really like more of a problem if we can get these programs and straighten out more men, there's a ripple effect that helps women, or is it just anyway, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, if you look statistically, when a man gets saved in a family, I forget what the percentage that the rest of the family gets saved. When the wife gets saved, it doesn't affect as much. Because the role of the man in society, I think. But we've really dropped the ball when it comes to women. I mean, if you go into Elyria, Lorraine, where we're at, it's just it's devastating how women have to live. A lot of women are prostituted by choice. They do that just to support their habits. And like I said, the challenge, I've known ministries that have started with women and have quit because of the issues. And so, I mean, I'm like the one, I like to meet the hardest, whatever the challenge is, give me the biggest challenge. And from being where we're at, we see that women are the biggest challenge, as far as biggest need, too, because there are a lot of men facilities.
But also the demographics in our area, too. There is a lot of men's facilities. There is almost no women's facilities. And we've seen an influx in the amount of women coming to the church and to some of the outreaches and things that we do, that there is a need. And so when there's a need, we meet the need. It's necessity.
Yeah.
So.
And we're working with women right now. It's undercover, though. I mean, the city really doesn't know about it. I mean, they probably do know.
They do now.
I don't care. You know, I've had some run-ins with the city over stupid regulations. And this past summer, we had to meet out for 3 months in our own parking lot because of some stupid fire code regulations. That the building was found safe when it was a school, but when we changed it to a place of worship, it changed the whole fire code regulations, even though the building's classified as unburnable. So I just don't understand. But I do understand what it is. You know, ultimately we're fighting against the enemy. But But that's what we did. We met out in the parking lot for 3 months. Our attendance actually increased, and so the city is the city.
Right in front here.
Yeah, so I kind of grew up Republican, raised Republican, lived in this neighborhood. 8 years ago, moved my family downtown to the hood, started a church, nonprofit. We do workforce development, getting people off the streets into jobs. And a lot of my perspective has changed, like being up close and personal to it, all that kind of stuff. Paul, we've been to lunch. To be honest with you, and I would resonate with a lot of the values in this room, the Democrats come through my program all the time and think really deeply about poverty and its solutions. And I've been grieved at kind of like my roots, because Republicans, by and large, this is my opinion, have one message around poverty: cut government benefits.
Mm-hmm.
When you actually look at Republican solutions, you just get the oppositional side of the brain that you were talking about, right? And so I guess my question is what is the Republican conservative platform? If they have the golden moment, to me, this is blunt, it'd be like junior hires showing up to the NBA to play ball, because they haven't thought deeply about solutions. At least when I talk to the Democrats, they're thinking through workforce, they're thinking through enablement. They actually think a lot about the issues. So I guess that's my question, is I would love to see a conservative revival of comprehensive, robust poverty solutions. But I've been looking for it for a long time.
Well, here it is.
I
Yeah,
think that's what you're
Welcome.
seeing right now.
But where are we going to make the link, though? Because we're so anti-government support, because we need 1,000 Step 13s and beyond the walls, right? Is there going to be a link between policy and scaling up these programs? Because I hear the anti-government benefits, but hey, we can do it if no strings attached. We all know this too. There's a bunch of faith-based programs
Right.
that have actually gotten the money and screwed us because they're so poor at how they manage it.
Yep.
Because the church hasn't been great stewards and doesn't do the reporting well and all
By
that
and
kind of
large,
stuff.
they've been really bad at it.
Right. So I guess that's my question. What is the conservative golden moment answer for scaling solutions?
That's a great question. Well, a couple answers that I would give, and you guys can jump in. But first of all, there is no federal program or state program that will create Paul Scudo, Paul Grodell, Greg Bradford. And that is a key part of the conservative vision, because really what we're talking about, and when people really want an answer in politics, and I've studied all kinds of polling, been in campaigns, the average voter who's interested, they're not going to want a white paper. They don't want this 40-step, 40-page, 50-page memo on how to end poverty. They want to know that you care. They want to know that you thought deeply about it. And you're absolutely right. Conservatives, by and large, have not thought as deeply as they need to. But I guarantee you that is changing. Paul Ryan is leading the charge on this. The films we just showed you, I've been in rooms where he's brought in members of Congress to have the same dialogue with Bob Woodson, and they get into the nitty-gritty, and they get called on the carpet if they're not embarrassed, but their lack of thoughtfulness is nurtured. It's sort of, he's bringing people along. So there's work happening behind the scenes that's deeply encouraging, that's real, and it's been reflected in the quality of the policy output on the Republican side. The House a Better Way agenda. You can read kind of the reports on that. But really, part of the answer is there is no one-size-fits-all. It's about getting government out of the way, but it's about selling and describing a worldview and a way of thinking about civil society and stepping into a gap. And again, not just berating or belittling the left's failure, because they have failed. And I think this election saw a lack of, for decades, Democrats have run on this, counterfeit compassion, we care ideology. But this election showed that check has bounced. There was nothing in that account. And so now there's this moment where we're having this dialogue. And again, these guys aren't here as political activists. We're here talking about trying to develop a vision among the real elites, which are we the people. Because that's really where the answers come from. It's empowering everyone in this room to think differently and do whatever they can wherever they are. So that's but you're right, it's a very deep complex, and it needs to be thought out deeply and thought through very thoroughly. But you have to communicate a clear vision to get people's attention.
Thanks for, do I go or no? Thanks for being with us tonight. It sounds like for several of the stories that this incarceration moment was this rock bottom moment that was transformational in your lives. There's a move towards treating drug abuse as more of a disease than something that one should be incarcerated for. What would be your response to that in terms of making the most positive impact in society?
You were the one that was in prison. I
Greg,
didn't get caught. Just a little
If you
bit.
keep picking fights with the city, maybe you'll have your turn.
Addiction is not a disease, in my opinion. Paul may disagree with me. There are 12-step programs that will disagree with me. There are people that will tell you that once an addict, always an addict, and they'll disagree with me. Addiction is a spirit, just like pornography and anger and
It's
hate
sin,
and rage. It's sin. It's a spirit. And a spirit is bondage, it's chains. So I know people that didn't go to prison and are sober. Prison wasn't my rock bottom. When I came out, I started using again. So I can't tell you that was it. It wasn't. Was it horrible? Yeah. Did it change me? It did momentarily. I was scared to death. But at the end of the day, it still boils down to the love of another human being. As far as your question being, was it seeing like incarceration was rock bottom? I had been to, by the time I was 21, I said I had been to a few rehabs. I was in 10 rehabs by the time I was 21 years old. I was in rehab for 8 months, came out 1 week, and I was using again. So.
If I could jump in there, I don't think the answer, and I really don't agree that addiction is a disease either, although I do think people are predisposed to it. You know, I came from a long line, but again, it goes to a spiritual root with that. But I don't. I think the war on drugs has showed us one thing, and I think it started with Nixon, if I'm old enough to remember, which was what, 1970 or something, a long time ago. The one thing a war on drugs has shown us is, like, the war on poverty hasn't worked. And so locking people up for being addicts is not the answer. You know, if they do something criminal because of their addiction, of course, yeah, let's put them in jail. But we have that whole war on drugs. I don't know if you as average American citizens realize the constitutional rights that you have lost because of the war on drugs, with the right to search and seizure and all that, and confiscation, and all in the name of the war on drugs. And that's not working. So we've got to look at a different approach. And I'm not for the legalization of drugs either. But what I'm saying is, you know, let's treat what people are struggling with instead of, you know, because there's a lot of people that say that it is a disease. Well, we don't lock up diabetics that don't take care of or take their insulin. So, I mean, either way you look at it, I think it's a clear understanding that jail time doesn't work. I don't know of any addicts that have gone to jail, come out sober, and here's an alarming rate. I don't know if it's like this out in Colorado. In Ohio, more and more prisoners are dying of overdoses in prison than in any time in the history of America. And you know, because the money is so large that there's so many guards that are willing to bring heroin in. And, you know, you could take it back to the whole prescription pill thing. I mean, it all goes back to it. There's a lot of profit that's made, number one, in the treatment of drug addiction, number two, in the prescribing of pills, and number three, the cartels see a need in the market, and so they go for it. And but you're not going to get rid of the money unless you get rid of the need, and you're not going to get rid of the need by locking people up. So I'm for locking up drug dealers, but not for addicts.
I think Jim over there had his hand up.
I did, yeah. But
Did you want to comment, Paul?
I do. I come from the other side of the fence in that there is much evidence that addiction is a disease. The cycle of the dopamine receptors and the glutamate memory cycle. But what isn't talked about the disease is it's a three-part disease: physical, mental, and spiritual. And in 99% of the people that find long-term recovery from the disease of addiction, they find a spiritual awakening. So what I am all for it being about treatment, because as someone that was a homeless crackhead, was brought into treatment, that's the way I was reconnected with God. I wouldn't have found God in jail or back on the street. It was through treatment around people that genuinely cared for me and loved me. I was exposed to a 12-step program where I was able to ease back into the spiritual thing till I was like, oh yeah, it's been there all along, right? And I was able to reconnect with that. But there's clear evidence that there's a physical nature and a mental nature to it as well. I agree with Paul. I think if you're found in possession of drugs, you shouldn't go to jail. But if you're dealing drugs or you do something violent or theft-oriented, there's also personal responsibility that goes to this, right? And sometimes it takes an idiot like me, because I went to prison too, 3 or 4 times of that. And to have your family and friends and society cut you off, for you to hit that level of spiritual despair to where you're willing to look for a connection with God again. So I do believe that it's a disease, and I think it needs to be treated that way, but the foundation in recovery is clearly spiritual. Thank you.
Right there, the gentleman in the second row with the...
Me? Okay, all right. Thank you. Stan Vanderwerf, and I came from Colorado Springs to listen to what you had to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Also, I just got elected county commissioner for El Paso County, and I'll be taking the oath on the 10th of January. And I wanted to speak to the gentleman's comment a little bit about Republicans appearing, to not seem to be part of this. Well, when we rely on government, and we've been increasingly relying on government, and we know that it doesn't work. Well, how did we solve problems before that? It's communities that solve problems. It's people in the communities that solve problems. So one of the things I did in my campaign, I said, look, I've got my statutory authorities. These are the things I'm required to do as a county commissioner. But I also have my moral authority, and the moral authority is what guides me to go forward. And for some of us, that's a higher authority that guides us, right, to go to that place. So what I would recommend is take that moral authority and go, right? Run with it. Find a nonprofit that you love. Go work with them. Try to make them better. That's working in this environment. Don't look back. Don't look back and just do it. Now, I use that in my campaign, this concept of statutory authority and moral authority. And it was interesting because I would be accused of people from the other side of the fence. Oh, you don't support that big government program. That means you...
What you said about civic associations is absolutely true. But we also, I think, and Paul Ryan do have an extraordinary anti-poverty program that goes to the harbor master. And with Bob Woodson, he's achieved so much in so many places. It's just extraordinary what he has done. Now for my question. See, the question, though, are the Republicans going to come around Paul Ryan? I don't know if that's true or not. They haven't exactly been joyful about it. And so that it seems to me is a question. Addiction and poverty, what is the relation? Is poverty mostly come from addiction? Does addiction mostly come from poverty? We've been talking about addiction. Is that...
Bob Woodson says it best. He says there's three types of poverty. You're born poor. You either you become poor and you're okay with being poor, or you make a decision and get poor. And he says it best when he says it, but those are really the only 3 ways you are poor. And so we've made decisions to get poor. There are people that are born poor, and there are people that are just okay with being poor. So
to add a caveat to that, I didn't make a conscious decision to become poor. So there is this 3.5 way that you become poor, where the compulsion and the obsession of drug and alcohol use or addiction, whether it's pornography or gambling or something that takes away the logical, rational decision-making ability in a human being to make unhealthy choices will drag you down. So to their points, there are individuals that are born into that lifestyle, but like we've heard, you heard Paul Ryan say it, you can work your way up out of that if you're motivated. There are people that are just lazy and okay with it, and I don't know what you can do about that. But then there are a subset of us that either choose with clear volition to be poor or don't know they're making that choice through addiction. I see them as being co-occurring issues. Addiction feeds poverty, poverty feeds addiction. It's the chicken or the egg in a lot of cases, and I think it depends on the individual.
From what I've seen, it's the families that suffer deeply from the addictions of the fathers. That really isn't relevant anymore because from what I see with working in the inner city and not just in the inner city, but now it's in the suburbs, is the fathers are not in the pictures of the families anymore. And so what's tragic now is we're seeing a generation where it's no longer single moms raising kids, but it's grandparents that are raising kids. I have a lot of grandparents that bring their kids to church, and it's because their moms are addicts and their dads have been addicts for, you know, it's kind of a status symbol in the hood how many baby mamas you have, and unfortunately that's the thinking, and none of those mothers get support, and when they do, they spend it on drugs. And because I've had people tell me, well, you know, people, because we work in the projects a lot when we do kids services and stuff, and we make sure we feed them, and they say, well, if you notice what kind of shoes they're wearing $150 Nikes. No, they're not. Now their fathers might be and their mothers might be because they're drug dealers or something, but those kids come to our church and their shoes don't fit them. They got holes in their tennis shoes. The best meal they get is what the church feeds them on a weekly basis. And so I see it as addiction causing poverty in families. With Greg's own personal family, the first time I met his wife, who was when Crystal was his ex-wife, we were doing a oil change for single moms. She was a single mom at the time. She didn't even have the money to get an oil change, and this was right after he went into prison. And I'm just, he's not, this guy here now is the best provider. His kids are spoiled, and so is his wife. And he just bought a beautiful home on 25 acres of land and never owned a home before. And I mean, he's a provider. But when I first met his wife, it was at a single mother's oil change. She didn't even have money for an oil change, and it was because he had blown all at one time he's a successful businessman, and it went all for crack. So his wife suffered, his children suffered, and your wife was on welfare because of your addiction. So.
Okay, we're gonna do one more question. Patricia, did you have a question?
I was just going to comment that I think it's wonderful when private sector is able to come in and do great things in this area, but to reach the number of people that we need to reach, we have to be willing to come up with a public sector solution so that tax dollars that are going to be spent to try to solve poverty issues and addiction issues actually get spent in a way that are effective instead of a way that's just money down the drain. And so the one country I've seen where they've done something incredibly unconventional, but it's been incredibly effective, is Portugal, where they decriminalized the use of drugs, not the selling of drugs, not the distribution of drugs, but the use of drugs was decriminalized. So people are arrested, it's a civil offense, and all of the money that they used to spend to incarcerate and punish and marginalize is now spent not just on treatment programs, but also on job training and integrating people back into their communities and integrating people back into their families and trying to rebuild the broken homes and communities that led to or were caused by the drug addiction in the first place. And they have cut their addiction rate in that country by 50% in the last 15 years.
Sure.
That's a huge number.
When you think about it, it makes much more sense than locking people up with addictions. I mean, I don't know who came up with that idea, but it was total.
Yeah, just one quick thought on the
way
role of the government, the public policy answer, is the real essence of what Paul Ryan is talking about with his opportunity grants agenda he put out a couple years ago. Within the House, Better Way agenda is modeled after that in many ways. There's some differences. But it's really this idea of flexibility and that there is no one-size-fits-all federal answer. But there are thousands of answers all over the country. And so the question is, well, how do you get the government out of the way without merely running on an anti-government message or anti-government policy, but instead give states the flexibility to identify the local harbor masters and come to them and say, what do you need? What are you doing? And again, every harbor is different. This Paul Scudo story is different from Paul Grodell's story. Why? Well, because they're different people. They have different skills. They have different needs in their community, and they've tailored their programs around their communities. And so we have to be careful about this idea of scaling, because you don't necessarily want to scale what you're doing in Step 13 for the whole country. You don't want to scale what you're doing in Ohio. You want to give each community the authority to scale in their own community and to succeed where they are. And I think that's really what the essence of Paul Ryan's agenda is.
Great. Can we give our panelists a round of applause? Paul, do you want to say something real quick?
No.
No,
I
do.
This has been the greatest panel or greatest audience I've ever been before.
I just want to say, real quick, you had a great point, man, about just the Republican, Democrat, the division. We're here to break the back of that stigma. You'll see that Paul and I have similar things, but we have very different things. We are not divided. We are like-minded. We have the same end result, and that's to see people get restored back to what God has called them to. And so while we may not see the same, like we would love to group with them and everybody else as part of the CNE thing and have Step 13s in Ohio and have Beyond the Walls in Colorado and everywhere else from nation to nation. This isn't about me or Paul or John or Bob Woodson or Paul Ryan. It's about the broken, and that's it.
Amen.
In Jesus Christ. And so thank you.
Amen.
Amen.